I was dead. I know that sounds strange. I guess it's an oxymoron. You have to be sentient to know anything, and if you're dead, you are not sentient. In other words, if I was dead, how could I be aware of that? I was having an espresso at Café a Brasileira, the oldest, most famous cafe in Lisbon, with wooden booths, mirrored walls, and a long oak-panel bar straight out of the 18th century. It is located in Rocio, in the Chiado district. What was really strange is how much I was enjoying looking at the local girls, particularly Maria Joao, who was walking towards me with a question in her eyes. As she approached, I started to ask her if the excitement I felt as I admired her quite charming young body was appropriate for a dead man. I wisely chose not to say anything as she asked, "Do you want Outrabica and are you coming over for dinner tonight?" I said, "Yes, and of course." I guess I should back up a little. Before I died, I was known as Dave Lawrence, loving husband of Maria, living in Colorado when I died. Now I am William Billy Sanderson, expatriate Yank from Colorado living in a comfortable apartment in Lisbon, in the Barrio Alto, on Rua do Norte. I had met Maria about 6 months ago here at the cafe. She was 28 at the time. Her aunt owned the place and she helped out sometimes. She was an anomaly for a girl from Portugal. She was tall, a little over 5 feet 10 inches. She wasn't slim, maybe willowy is better. She weighed about 120 pounds, with gentle flowing curves rather than ostentatious ones. Long legs that won't quit. If you've seen Daniela Hanachova, 5 feet 11 inches, 123 pounds, you know what I mean. She had, I guessed at the time, 34B breasts that seemed to have an attitude. Her long legs flowed up into the most hauntingly beautiful as I had ever seen. She had kind of a dirty blonde hair and fair, regular features, with an upturned button nose. She was light-skinned with brilliant powder blue eyes with a few freckles around them. Later I was to find she had freckles elsewhere. In other words, if you spent some time in Lisbon looking at the local girls and saw her walking toward you, she would stand out. Maria was born on the island of Terceira in the Azores. Her father was an American tech sergeant in the weather office of the 65th Air Base Wing at Lodges Field. Her mother was a local girl and worked in the base library. They met, and, well, things happened, marriage and Maria following in short order. The family moved around the world with her dad's duty assignments, until he was killed in a car crash. At the time he was stationed at Pope Air Force Base and Maria was a junior majoring in marketing with a minor in literature at Duke University. After her dad died, her mom moved to Lisbon to work with her sister at the cafe while Maria Joao finished her studies. After graduating, she joined her mom in Lisbon working part-time at the cafe and part-time with a friend putting together a small agency for writers of romance novels, pulp fiction, working particularly on translations to and from various languages. After a year, she met and married a football player, right half, who played for Sporting Lisbon. After they had a daughter, Katrina, his contract was purchased by Manchester City. Maria and the baby were to follow when he got settled, but he met a dancer and, short story, he called her and said, "Don't come." Maria was pretty broken up about this, but after a year she realized that her ex was just a happy jock that would still be a kid when he died. The agency did better than they expected and had signed up a number of writers from the US, Spain, and Portugal, with a couple from France and Ireland. That brought me back to being dead and admiring Maria. She stopped by a couple of times that evening to chat, and when she finished I walked her home. Like I said, I had known her for about 6 months. I probably would have not gotten anywhere with her, until once over coffee she talked about needing writers for English. She needed translators and was looking for new writers also. I was fluent in Spanish and started translating romance stories from the US and England into Spanish. I told her that I had always wanted to write and thought it might be fun. I showed her the short stories and the one novel I had been working on. So it started. I began with the translations and then threw in a few romance novels, sheesh, of my own. Through all of this, I started spending more time with Maria Joao and Katrina. As we walked the few blocks to her apartment, she put her arm in mine, and we chatted and looked in the bakery windows for dessert. I was starting to feel pretty good until we stopped by her mom's to pick up Katrina, who was 4 at this time. As we started climbing the stairs, the door opened and this whirling dervish came flying through the air screaming, "Billy! Billy!" I hadn't been intimate with Maria, but it seemed we were getting close. She was lonely, but she was also very protective of her daughter. I fell in love with Katrina the moment I saw her. In my other life, quiet. We had never had kids, maybe if we had. Anyway, I really liked Katrina and she kinda took possession of me. One of the reasons I hadn't gotten further with Maria was because her daughter always seemed to be between us. I grabbed Katrina as I tried to keep from falling down the stairs and started tickling her. She squiggled out of my arms giggling and ran up the stairs to her grandma, FIA. We chatted for a little and then went to Maria's apartment. Maria asked, "Could you give Katrina her English lesson while I fix the dinner? We are having bacalhau bras with a nice vinho verde with it." I had been working with Katrina for about 2 months with children's books in English. She loved the stories, and most nights when I was there I would make up a story for her after her mom put her in bed. She would fight to stay awake but always fall asleep after about 5 minutes. I think this was Maria's secret plan in having me help with her English. While we eating the cod and enjoying the green wine, Maria looked at me seriously for a minute and said, "We need to talk after Katrina goes to sleep." I thought, oh God, what did I do now? I finished the meal with some trepidation but no idea what she wanted to talk about. We sat around drinking coffee and enjoying a very nice vintage tawny port for a while as Katrina played with her toys. Maria got her daughter ready for bed and started cleaning up the kitchen while I told Katrina her story. I was sitting on the sofa sipping another small port when Maria came in. "Can I sit down with you?" she quietly asked. I opened my arms and she slipped into them as she sat on my lap. Not knowing what was going on, I sat there without moving, with my arms around her. After a minute, I could see her shoulders gently shaking. I lifted up her chin and stared into her eyes. She was crying. "Maria, what's wrong?" With that, she started sobbing. I just helplessly held her and waited for her to calm down. After a bit, she looked up and wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her blouse. She looked at me for a minute, quietly, and then buried her face in my shoulder. With a muffled voice, she whispered, "Billy, I know you care for me, and the way you were with Katrina has been priceless for me. No, don't say anything yet. I'm lonely," she whispered. "I want you. I want to be with you." Neither of us has said anything, but I think God wants us to be together. You are the answer to my prayers for myself and Katrina. Maria. No, wait. Let me finish. I'm so happy with you, but I haven't been honest. With that, she started sobbing again. After a bit, she continued, "I've told you about Paolo, my ex-husband. Billy, I'm Catholic. You know that. I can't get a divorce and I can't marry you." She slid to the floor and her body just shook with her crying. Stunned, I sat there for a minute. Marriage? Should I hadn't said anything about that? I mean, Christ, I'm dead. I can't marry anyone. After a while, Maria quieted down and fell in a restless sleep. Looking at her, I didn't know what to do. Finally, I picked her up and carried her into her bedroom and lay her down. I dampened a washcloth and gently bathed her face. She twisted restlessly but didn't wake up. I didn't know what to do. Finally, I realized I would have to put her to bed. I got a gown from her dresser and gently took her clothes off. Then I did the hardest thing I had ever done in either of my lives. I put her gown on, careful not to awaken her. I covered her up, and not wanting to leave her alone like that, I lay on the top of the sheet, next to her. It took me a while to get to sleep, and I started replaying what had happened. I had not really thought about the problems of marriage. Her problem was easy. That's just religion. Mine, geez. I have a wife in jail, probably for life. If I were to try for a divorce, then obviously I wouldn't be dead anymore. If I loved a woman enough to marry her, how could I live a lie and be a bigamist? Life sure is complicated when you are dead. I woke in the first faint light of dawn to see Maria sitting in bed staring at me. Blushing violently, she asked, "Billy, how did I get in bed with my gown on?" I looked at her for a minute. She was softly lovely in the early morning light. "Maria, you fell asleep on the floor. I carried you in and laid you on the bed. I was going to go to my apartment, but I couldn't leave you like that. I put your gown on and covered you up. I lay down because I just didn't know what else to do." Damned if I was going to tell her there was 5 minutes between undressing her and putting her gown on. She seemed to blush even more. I swear I could see the freckles multiplying through the thin gauze of her gown. Embarrassed, she lay beside me and hid her face in my shoulder again. Christ, this was getting to be a habit, not that I minded, of course. After a few minutes, maybe 10, I put my arm around her and pulled her tight. "Maria, it's my turn to talk. Just hush for a bit and let me talk now." I turned her head and gently brushed my lips against hers. Startled, I pulled back and had an epiphany. Jesus, God, I did love her. With all my being, I did love her. Maria lay there looking up at me with a curious smile on her face. I kissed that lovely little smile. She lay, not moving, with her eyes closed. She gasped, "Oh, Billy. Oh, Billy. God, I've been so lonely. Love me. Make love to me, even if it's just for now." We made love. I lay still and realized she was crying again, but as she looked up, I saw it was cry for happy. Billy, I don't care what happens. I love you. I just want to live with you. Love you. I need you. Katrina needs you. Love me now, please. We loved one another until we heard Katrina moving in her room. Looking at me, she said, Billy, we have to talk. But this time she had a smile on her face. We had our talk, and a few weeks later I moved in with her. After a time, I became a Portuguese citizen and adopted Katrina. I started working with her and her partner in her agency. I stopped doing translations and focused on writing romance novels and was almost too successful. I used a nom de plume, a name you would well recognize, a woman's name. After a couple of years, we bought a nice apartment in Cascais, 4 or 5 blocks from the sea. We never again mentioned marriage, but frequently talked of our love. I was happy as never before. My time of darkness, my time of death was over. I was alive. The end. Not. Shit happens. Oh yeah. I bet you are wondering how I died. It seems a lifetime ago. Some of the details I've forgotten. Some of the rage has left, some. I no longer think much about Maria. She may or may not still be in prison. I don't really give a shit. It wouldn't bother me if she were released. It wouldn't bother me if she rotted in jail. I've never cared enough to find out. I'm happy as long as the witch stays out of my life. What I remember most is the white-hot anger that overwhelmed me when I saw the email messages. I wasn't looking for them. I wasn't concerned about anything. I had a happy marriage. Somehow I got a virus on the PC and had to reinstall some of the applications. The biggest problem seemed to be the email system. Before I uninstalled it, I copied the email archive file to a zip disk and then reinstalled the email software. In doing this, I of course wiped out any existing passwords, so it was left with the blank default password. I made a mental note to let Maria know what I'd done. I installed the software and reloaded the email archive. I decided I'd better check and make sure everything was working. Everything else seemed to be okay now, so it seemed this would fix the problem. My email came up okay. Great so far. I pondered for a minute and decided I'd better check Maria's email also. She gets real bitchy when the computer doesn't work right. The way the blank password works is that you have to change it before you can use the software for the first time. I figured I'd just reinstall the software again after I checked everything out. Otherwise, she would bitch at me. So I entered a password and opened her email. And I started dying. The headers were certainly catchy. The dialogue between this jerk Andrew and Maria was hot. The pictures were even hotter. Hottest of all was my anger. A burning, vicious, killing anger. I couldn't breathe for a minute. I ran into the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face and heaved, trying to breathe. Suddenly, I ran into the toilet area and really heaved. I felt like my guts were coming out. I went into my office and poured a small glass of Oban and gulped it down. Then a bigger one. Then another one. I finally calmed down. I stopped drinking. I started breathing. I started thinking. My anger had coalesced into a tight, hard ball where my heart used to be. It felt like a cancer eating away, destroying me from the inside. It took years and a beautiful 4-year-old girl before this cancer in my heart started to dissolve. Christ, I hated her. Christ, I hated him. I focused on my hate. Let that keep me going. I resolved. I was smart. I had a good imagination. My dad had always told me that when bad times come, and they will, he said, don't give in to your weaknesses and stand on your strengths. I never asked him what had happened to him that he felt he had to tell me this over and over, but by God I listened and I heard him. And I remembered. My strength is my writing. I write novels. Sometimes I write crime novels and/or detective and/or murder, but always a mystery. I was successful. I was well known. I researched. I talked to cops. I talked to cons. I talked to judges, reporters, and victims. I knew a lot of people. I met a con at the Colorado Territorial Prison in Cannon City a few years ago. I did him some favors, cigarettes, helping his son out of a jam, etc., for taking the time to talk with me, helping me to solve a plot problem. A few years later, he was released. I helped him get a job. I did him a few more favors. I occasionally paid him for research. He walked the walk. He talked the talk. He added veracity to my stories. He added money to my bank account. Now, in my time of need, real need, I remembered Glenn. I drove down to see him, picked up a couple of cases of cold brews on the way, and said, Glenn, I need to die. Actually, I need to have my wife and her a-hole buddy, really. I saw the photos. Murder me. And they need to be caught. And they need to go to jail. I told him the whole story and asked him for help. We treated it like a new idea for a novel, and someday I might write it, under a different nom de plume, of course. I lay out a storyboard. We covered all the details. Anyone watching us would think we were plotting to rob Fort Knox. So this is what we did. We planned everything to happen when she went on her next seminar. I went back to Evergreen, a fantastically beautiful place in the foothills west of Denver. I became the most loving husband. Maria was puzzled at times, but I just loved her and kept on with my writing. The sex got a little rougher. Instead of complaining, she seemed to enjoy it more. She was happier every day, and I died a little each day. She became a piece of meat to me. I used her. But then she had been using me for years. I told her about the computer problem, of how I reinstalled the software and it would have a blank password. I made sure she knew she would have to enter a password before she could check her email, the lying, cheating bitch. Meanwhile, I got smart. She was changing her password regularly, but all I had to do was copy her email archive file to my laptop and fire it up. I tracked her email every day. Andrew sent her a message asking if I ever noticed anything. She replied, "No, if anything, he is even more loving." God, what an idiot he is. Andrew sent back, "Yeah, but he's my idiot. I do love him, but I also love to have sex with you. He is so caught up in his writing that the only way he would notice anything is if he wrote it himself." Idiot my arse, I thought. One of my favorite cliches is he who laughs last, laughs best. 3 months later, it was time for her next seminar, this time in San Antonio. She was going for the usual 5 days. She was also going to hell for eternity, but she didn't know that yet. Yeah, I know. You think I'm a vindictive SOB. Damn straight. Was I weeping? You think I'll weep? No, I'll not weep. I have full cause of weeping, but this heart shall break into 100,000 flaws. Or ere I'll weep. Hell no, I wasn't weeping. It's time to die. All the planning Glenn and I had done broke into 3 main parts that had to merge together perfectly. How to kill me. How to get me reborn. How to send the sinners to hell. Everything was in place. Now it was time to act. The first problem was money. I had to leave totally transparently. I couldn't take anything with me except the clothes I would have on. I had a commission check I'd been holding on to. As soon as Maria left, I went to the bank and deposited the check, a little over 20 grand. I kept out about $2,500, typical for ongoing expense funds. This would get me started. Most of that money could disappear with me. It wasn't near what I needed, though. Maria had some heirloom jewelry she had inherited from her grandmother. I don't know the current value, but when we had them assessed for insurance several years ago, they came out at spot on $250,000. They were too valuable to keep in the house and too old-fashioned for darling Maria to wear, so we kept them in a large safety deposit box at the bank. They were kept in a lockbox within the safety deposit box. Both keys were kept in our safe at home. While she was still on her previous, infamous trip, I went to the bank and took the jewelry out and left a large envelope filled with last year's tax papers in the front of the box. I gave the jewelry to Glenn to dispose of. He got just under 100 grand for it. I gave him 10 grand for his help and hoped the rest would last me long enough for the expenses involved with my death and enough to live on for a year or so. I kept out a beautiful emerald brooch worth around 5 grand. I would use this later. A couple of days after Maria got back from San Antonio, I caught her just as she was leaving for work. "Babe, could you do me a favor? I have an envelope with tax papers in the bank vault that I need. Could you run over during lunch and pick it up for me?" "Sure, honey. Could you grab the key for me?" "It's right here. I got it out of the safe while you were taking your shower." "Thanks a million. I'll give you a back rub tonight to thank you." "Oh, I can hardly wait. Will you wait hard, Ly?" She laughed. Without the key to the lockbox, she wouldn't be able to look at the jewelry. Not that she would have any reason to view it. The last time the lockbox had been opened was when we had all the pieces appraised. Now she was on record as the last one to use the safety deposit box. The tax papers I left in my file cabinet at home, ready for anyone that cared to look at if she even remembered picking them up. Next, I needed documentation. I knew this was going to be expensive. Glenn had another friend. This guy had worked in the documentation section of the CIA for over 30 years. He was essentially paid to forge documents, everything an agent would need to get into a foreign country. I didn't need that much. I talked it over with Glenn, and we figured on a passport, well-used, driver's license, car insurance card, with insurance in force if anyone asked, international driver's license, Visa and Amex cards, bank letter of credit. You get the picture. This was going to cost me $10,000 if I could wait 6 months, or for $20,000 I could get them in 6 weeks. I could not wait 6 months. I had letters from my new agent about a romance novel done under my new name. I had a manuscript almost ready for editing. We started the messy business of killing me. First, we needed blood. Glenn knew a guy that had worked in the infirmary at the state prison. We met in a back room of a bar in Trinidad, south of Denver, almost to the New Mexico line. He took about a dozen vials of my blood and put them in a cooler with ice. I put some blood in the trunk of her car and then did a half-assed job of trying to clean it up. I put a couple of drops of blood in the corner of the trunk along with some fuzz from a burlap bag. I stuck a couple of hairs from my head on the blood while it was still moist. I also put blood on the laundry room throw rug leading to the garage. This I half-assed cleaned up. I added a few drops underneath the rear bumper of the car. Glenn got a shovel from Andrew's shed and left it in my shed. Again, I put some blood on it and did a little better job of cleaning it off. But not perfect. In the middle of the night, Glenn picked the lock at Andrew's apartment and we went in. I got some hairs from Andrew's brush to put in my brush at home and a couple to put under the pillow in our master bedroom. I carefully got an empty beer can from his trash to put in our kitchen trash. I got lucky and found a tied-off condom in the wastebasket in his bathroom. That got thrown behind our toilet bowl in our bath. It would take a good cleaning to spot it, or a good search. Finally, I took the emerald brooch and, wrapping in one of his handkerchiefs, put it in the bottom drawer of his armoire beneath some of his sweaters. Glenn had gotten a cell phone in Andrew's name, and I used that to call her hotel. I knew he was not taking his car because Maria's company always provided limo service for the airport. I took, and later replaced, the key to his locker at Cherry Chase Country Club where he belonged. I went to the club for lunch and then wandered into the locker room. No one was around, so I left the cell phone in his locker. Of course, Glenn and I were both very careful to leave no signs of our passing presence. The night before Maria left, I had arranged for Glenn to pick up Maria's car and drive it down to Denver and back. On the stretch of I-70 comings down from the foothills, they have one of those new photo radar detectors. The radar picks up anyone going down the hill more than 10 miles over the limit and snaps a picture of the license plate. It's on trial and it's not clear whether it was legal or not, but we didn't care. We just wanted to place her car there at an early morning hour. Starting from a few days before Maria left, I was careful to leave no footprints, such as reading my email when I was supposed to be dead. I left my billfold with everything in it in the silver tray in the drawer of my dresser where I always left it. There was a little over $600 in it, about the usual amount. Not wanting to leave my usual mess, I ate out, but no more fast food. I just stopped. Quit. I didn't have any coffee, tea, beer, taking nothing in what I did not consider to be my home anymore. In fact, I cut out hard liquor. I needed to stay sharp and not make any mistakes. I was staying with Glenn and driving back and forth. Hell, I didn't even take a piss in the house. I didn't go to any of my usual hangouts, not my favorite bars, restaurants. I stayed away from anywhere I might run into a friend. All my visits to the house were late at night, and I parked Glenn's car at least a block away. I got a new prescription for my blood pressure and cholesterol medicine from the same guy that drew my blood. I renewed over the internet in my new name and had them sent to Glenn's address. I didn't go to any local grocery stores and drugstores. I was as close to invisible as possible. I was leaving a lot, a bunch of money, a way of life I enjoyed, and a few friends I would miss. Thankfully, there wasn't much family left. My sister was living in Boston, and I just saw every other year or so. She would miss me, but with the kids, her husband, and her job, she would be okay. I left about $600,000 in cash or near cash in various checking, savings, and money market accounts. My IRA was probably around $500,000. The house in Evergreen had about $700,000 in equity. Most of all, I left my career as a crime writer. I was good at it. I made tons of money from it. I had 4 novels under contract, 2 of which I had already received advances for. One of those was in the editing process and would be published in a couple of months. I left my car in the garage, my lovely silver BMW coupe, the M6. It sure looked like I was going to miss my Beamer more than I would Maria. I wish I had kids to leave all this to. But if I had kids, I wouldn't have done it this way. Sure, I would have thrown her sorry ass out, but I would have lost this precious revenge. Every day since Glenn and I had started planning this, especially on those nights after we made it, I never made love to her again after seeing those emails. I pulled my revenge out and caressed it. I petted it. I loved it. It was literally precious to me. Was I vindictive? You bet your sweetest I was. Finally, it was time for lights out. time to die. Glenn drove me down to Albuquerque where I gave him a big hug and said goodbye. I caught a bus to El Paso. All my documentation looked used as appropriate. My luggage was even more used. At El Paso, I filled the luggage up with new clothes, totally different brands and styles down to shoes, socks, and underwear. Then I took a taxi into Juarez. I caught another bus to Mexico City. There I took a plane to Buenos Aires. I stayed there for a week decompressing and enjoying some excellent food and wine. I got my hair restyled and a more modern look for my eyeglass frames. I then took a different airline to Madrid and on to Lisbon by train. I settled into a nice apartment. I joined a local sports club and started exercising. I really cleaned up my eating habits. As I said, I had cut out fast food cold turkey. I lost 20 pounds in the first 4 months. It didn't take long before both my blood pressure and cholesterol were down and I could stop taking the pills. As I lost weight, I gradually replaced my clothes with a more European look. I had always looked down on romance novels, but I knew I was going to have to start earning some money. I was fluent in Spanish, so I started reading all the Pulp Fiction romance stuff in both English and Spanish I could find. I started lining out some story ideas. I wrote a few short stories and then picked up the manuscript I had brought with me. I reworked it based on my readings and started looking for a publisher. You know what happened with Maria João. I love her very much and totally adore Katrina. I'm picking up Portuguese quicker than I thought I would be able to. Life is good. Oh, and my loving wife, Maria? Would I ever cry over her? Nah, I don't think so. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It was a warm evening, the temperature in the low 80s. An occasional breeze wafted through the window causing the curtains to flutter sporadically. The kitchen clock, mounted on the opposite wall, ticked the minutes away, sounding loud in the stillness of the room. Ken Weber noticed neither the breeze nor the clock. His thoughts were inward, confused, angry. He was still trying to make some sense of what he had witnessed that evening. He had thought to surprise his bride-to-be by just showing up at her office at quitting time. He was supposed to be away for 5 days, but the training session had been cut short by a day due to the illness of the lead trainer. He had arrived at her office building just as the workers were streaming out of the front door. His eyes had quickly picked up Connie's tall, slender form as she exited the building, and he was about to call out to her. But the words of welcome died in his throat when he noticed the man who was with her. They were so wrapped up in each other that they didn't even notice him, standing just yards away. It was their apparent intimacy that caused Ken to pause. Connie's hand was wrapped in his arm, and she was chatting animatedly, her eyes sparkling. Ken had stood there for long moments, too shocked to even think clearly. With a shake of his head, he quickly followed the happy couple to the parking lot next to the office building. They moved down the last row of autos until Ken saw them headed toward the distinctive silver Jag that Connie's parents had given her for her 24th birthday that spring. They were apparently oblivious to the few people in the area. Upon reaching the Jag, she turned to her companion, and Ken's heart had almost stopped when he saw her lean into Chuck Moore, place her hand behind his head, and pull his mouth down to hers. It was no mere peck. It was a prolonged, deep kiss. Ken saw Chuck's hand descend to her bum and squeeze gently. Her quiet laughter was a dagger in his heart. He had seen enough. Ken turned and quickly moved from the parking lot. Upon reaching the street, he hailed a passing cab and went home. He had a lot to think about. Ken Weber had met Connie Sterling at, of all places, a church social for singles. He was 24 and doing quite well at the investment bank where he worked since graduating with his degree in finance 2 years previously. The bank president had made himself Ken's mentor, and it was virtually impossible for him to refuse the invitation. Sterling had intercepted Ken in the hall. Placing a meaty hand on his chest, he rumbled, "Kenneth, I really must insist that you be our guest this Saturday. I know that you've been working your behind off in the office and at school, and you do need to get out and meet people. Who knows, you may even see a young lady there that captures your interest," said Horace Sterling with a chuckle. "I also have noted that you do not seem to be a churchgoer, Kenneth. That shocks my wife and I. It is absolutely essential that you belong to a church. You must put your soul in the hands of those who can guide you." Sterling had recently, for some reason, singled Ken out for his special attention, which, while flattering, also tended to be a bit uncomfortable at times. Sterling was also the deacon of his church, and his wife, Margaret, was the head of the ladies' auxiliary and the primary arbiter of church social matters. Ken had clenched his teeth and forced a smile to his lips. He considered Sterling to be an a-hole of the first order and a total hypocrite. In business, he was an immoral shark with absolutely no sense of ethics or integrity. Ken had already made up his mind that this was not the location for any long-term plans. He would stay for a couple of more years for the experience and then move on. Fortunately, he would be receiving his MBA in a few months. Thank you, sir. I appreciate the invitation and I'll certainly be there, bearing any unexpected difficulties, Ken waffled. Sterling's eyes narrowed a bit and his voice became just a little less jovial. Oh, you'll be there, my boy. I know that you won't disappoint me, he said quietly, patting Ken on the shoulder and walking away. Ken watched the tall, very stout man waddle down the hallway. I'm not sure that I can take another 2 years of this, he muttered quietly to himself as he walked to his office. Hey, Kenny, I see that Papa got his claws into you, chuckled Reggie from the doorway. Ken looked up and laughed, albeit a bit feebly. Hi, Reg, come in and take a load off. Reggie Sterling was Horace's only son and as different from the father as night is from day. He was tall, blonde, and slim with a wicked sense of humor. He and Ken had gotten to be friendly and had astounded his new friend by freely admitting that he deserved to be VP of Community Relations only because he hadn't the talent to be anything else. I get along smashingly with the ladies and their husbands don't find me to be a threat. The fools, so Papa made me a VP. Not a bad deal, Kenny. What? And he laughed delightedly. He had a self-deprecating sense of humor and almost constantly assumed the British nobility tone, a sly dig at the pretentiousness of his family. Okay, Ken, what does the old man want from you now? It seems that he's had his eye on you for a bit, Reggie asked. Ken related the brief conversation and the invitation that Sterling had extended, emphasizing that it was more like a command. Damn, Reggie, I really don't know why your dad wants me there. It's really not related to anything to do with me. Reggie seemed thoughtful for a moment. Well, Ken, I'm not sure myself. You know what kind of religious nut he is. Maybe he's worried about your soul. That very thought seemed to tickle Reggie, and he laughed as he arose. Don't worry about it, Kenny. I'll watch your back. I have a few suspicions, and if something is going on, I'll know it, he said, and he waved and left the office. Ken looked after him for a moment, puzzlement evident on his face. He then shrugged and returned to the paperwork on his desk. Ken was no fool. He knew that he had to at least put in an appearance to appease Sterling, so the following Saturday evening saw him park his car and stroll into the front doors of the huge, pretentious house of worship. There were a stream of people heading in the same direction, and he allowed himself to be swept along into the main ballroom of the building. He glanced about him and noticed that while this was supposed to be a singles affair, there were quite a number of older, middle-aged couples present. He was just a bit puzzled by this incongruity until he saw that almost all of them were accompanied by a much younger, single female. It seemed almost like a coming-out party for the single girls of the congregation. Ken smiled to himself. Oh no, he muttered, not this boy. Kenneth, my boy, boomed a loud voice behind him. So glad you decided to attend this little soiree. I told my wife you would be here. Let me introduce you. Sterling put that meaty hand on his shoulder and turned him. Ken saw before him a heavy, buxom woman with an imperious glare in her eye, examining him as if he were a specimen on a slide. Ken quickly took the proffered hand, resisting the impulse to bow and kiss the huge stone on her finger. He had to suppress the giggle this provoked. Mrs. Sterling, I'm delighted to meet you, he said unctuously. Mrs. Sterling smiled, which appeared more of a grimace, and nodded to her husband. Thank you, Kenneth, she wheezed, her adenoids obviously needing attention. Please allow me to introduce our daughter to you. This is Constance, she said as she almost forcibly pulled a tall, blonde, slender woman from behind her. Ken was momentarily stunned. This was totally unexpected. It was hard to fathom. How could two so totally repulsive creatures like the Sterlings produce such an absolutely gorgeous woman? She was tall, just a bit shorter than his 6 feet, tall even considering her high heels. Constance was stunning with her blonde tresses shoulder length and her eyes a deep blue. She was also blushing furiously, and he could see the anger in her eyes. Ken gathered himself together quickly. Miss Sterling, it is a distinct pleasure to meet you. I hope that you'll save a dance for me this evening, and he made sure that her parents didn't see the wink or sympathetic smile. She looked at him quizzically for a moment and grinned. Thank you, Mr. Weber. I think that's possible, she said quietly. Ken smiled to himself and wondered how she knew his last name. Well, that's rather obvious, he thought. Looks like the ogres had him singled out as possible marriage material, which was rather peculiar. He certainly wasn't a part of the social set, and he certainly didn't have the requisite bank balance for such an honor. This was a conundrum that would require a bit of thought. Ken made it a point to dance with Constance as soon as the band started playing. Looks like the old folks have designs, don't they? He asked with a smile. Constance looked at him appraisingly. You catch on quickly, don't you? It really wasn't all that difficult, Ken laughed. Constance sighed, a small frown on her face. I'm really sorry about that. It's most embarrassing, but they insisted that I come with them tonight, and since I still live at home, I really had no choice. This dance really fulfills your obligation. You really needn't ask me to dance again. If you don't mind, I would truly like to occupy your time this evening, and that has nothing to do with any obligations, Ken said softly. Constance looked at him closely and was reassured. I think I'd like that, she smiled. They did dance that night, and he, quite easily, managed to acquire her phone number. A few calls, some interesting conversations, and they started to date. Ken's interest in Connie was apparent, and he was eagerly encouraged by both Margaret and Horace Sterling. It seemed almost ludicrous how they doted upon him, and even started to call him son. He would shake his head in puzzlement before he discovered the reason for the Sterlings' interest in him as a prospective son-in-law. Ken proceeded cautiously with Connie. After all, any impropriety on his part could come back to bite him in the back. It was on their third date that things did get interesting. They had had dinner in a small French bistro and were strolling back to the car when Connie, her head almost on Ken's shoulder, whispered to him, Honey, let's go back to the house. It's getting chilly out. Ken's disappointment was apparent. Shit, he would have to face the dragons again. Connie looked up at him and commented casually, Oh, Kenny, didn't I mention that Mom and Dad left this evening for the weekend? They drove to visit my mother's sister. She paused, a glint in her eye as she grinned at him. They won't be back for 2 days. Back at the house, Ken didn't have time to worry about acting improperly. Connie had them nude and in her bed just moments after entering the front door. She was voracious, demanding, and their wild coupling brought them to the crest and over in just a matter of what seemed like minutes. Ken lay beside her, breathing heavily. Geez, Connie, if this is what sex is like with you, I'm gonna need a vitamin supplement, he chuckled. His eyes devoured her as she lay there, her skin bronzed and covered with a soft sheen of perspiration. Better stock up, big boy. I love sex, and I especially love sex with you, she murmured. She then, suddenly, leaned over him and kissed him. Do you love me, Kenny? She asked, almost breathlessly. Tell me that you love me, she now demanded. Ken took her by the shoulders and looked at her intently. Damn, you know something? I believe I do. I think that I've fallen in love with you, Constance Sterling. Good, she purred, because I love you, and I want to be with you forever and forever, Kenny. Connie then suddenly lifted herself and straddled him. The announcement of their engagement caused major ripples in the social fabric of the community. The small local paper featured it on their front page, and photos in the paper showed a beaming Horace and Margaret Sterling with Connie at their side. There was a photo of Ken on page 6. Suddenly, Ken's position at the bank took a major turn. He was given more responsibility, and it was apparent that he was being groomed for a major promotion. Ken's conscience was a problem for him. He knew that all of this largesse was coming to him because of his coming marriage, but was at a loss as to how to handle it. He wanted to rise in the ranks because of his abilities, not because of his marriage to the boss's daughter. It was a few months after the announcement of the engagement that Reggie Sterling strolled in Ken's office again and sprawled on a chair in front of his desk. How's it going, Ken? Is Carol enjoying her new job? What is she now? Some sort of administrative aide or something? Ken smiled indulgently. She's the personal assistant to the director of human resources at Keats Advertising in the city, Reg. If you contacted your family occasionally, you would know that, his tone taking the sting from his remarks. Reg nodded absently. He shifted in his seat, and it was apparent that he was uncomfortable. Kenny, I know that I've congratulated you, yet there is something that I feel you should know. I've debated with myself as to the wisdom of giving you this information, and have decided that it's something of which you should be aware. Ken looked at his friend with some puzzlement. It was apparent that Reggie was a lot more solemn than usual. In fact, he didn't recall Reggie ever being solemn. Okay, Reg, what's so important? Reggie took a deep breath and continued. Early last year, and I hasten to add, before the two of you even met, Connie had an abortion. The old folks were scandalized, horrified, and, well, whatever, you can imagine. What was even worse, and even though she was spirited away to another state for the procedure, some word of it leaked and Connie was spoiled goods in the minds of our very forgiving and compassionate community. Do you see where I'm going with this, Kenny? That's the reason why my mother and father roped you in. You were this young, fresh-faced kid from the bank with the right credentials. You were well educated, from the right school, and with a lot of potential. Also, you knew nothing about this little problem, and Connie would wind up with a good husband, making a good income and becoming a big fish in the community. Reggie paused, finding it difficult to meet Ken's gaze. Ken was quiet for a bit, mulling over what he had just heard. "This was before Connie and I met?" he asked. Reggie nodded. He then rose and started to pace, obviously agitated. He started to speak, hesitated, and then with a sigh, sat down again. "I'm sorry, Ken. I've agonized about this, but decided that you had to know." Ken nodded slowly. "Who was it? Reg? Who knocked her up? I think that I would like to know that." Reggie grimaced, obviously not enjoying the conversation. "No definitive proof, but I believe I know. Connie was hot and heavy with Chuck Moore, the assistant pastor at our sister congregation in Downingtown, just a few miles away. The two churches get together quite often for community events, etc. The two were an item, but when Connie's pregnancy became known, he just disappeared. He hasn't been seen here since then. He stays quite close to home. So it's just a matter of putting the pieces together, although it's all just conjecture." Ken nodded again. "Yeah, just conjecture," he muttered. Reggie leaned forward. "Kenny, I had to tell you, but I trust that while this is important, it really doesn't change anything. I told you this because I felt it was best that you hear it now and from me, rather than from some spiteful asshole who would try to make trouble later on. I know that Connie loves you and it's apparent that you love her. It shouldn't have happened, but it was all before you two even met. You do understand, Ken, right?" Ken nodded again. "Okay, Reg, I understand, and you're probably right. It was before we met. I don't see why it should be a major problem, but I am glad that you told me. Stuff like this would eventually make its way back, and I'll now be prepared. Thanks, Reg." Reggie sighed, a smile of relief on his face. "Righto, Ken, old boy. That's the attitude. I'm looking forward to the festivities," and he waved as he walked from the office. Ken sat quietly for a bit. He was more disturbed than he cared to admit. His thoughts bounced about a bit. It was before we met, so no big deal. He accepted that. So why was there this little niggling uneasiness in the back of his mind? The date of the wedding was quickly approaching. In a little over 3 months, Ken and Connie would be wed, and the activities associated with that event came fast and furious. Caterers and musicians had been hired, the ballroom had been reserved, flowers had been ordered, and the wedding list made up, culled, redrawn, and culled again. Ken's parents had both perished in a small plane crash while he was in college, and since he was an only child, there were very few names on his guest list. But well over 350 guests were on the Sterling list, from family, friends, work associates, and leaders of the community such as the mayor, congressmen, and major business owners. The final list would be just shy of 400 people. Ken was aware of the magnitude of the affair, but shrugged. He had little responsibility for any of it, and it was just as well. He really had no stomach for the ostentatious display. But for some reason, the information that Reggie had imparted seems to nudge at him. He realized that all of this was before he even met Connie, so he was puzzled that he couldn't just put it aside. This nagging just didn't seem to go away. Ken felt that he needed a little more information, and with that in mind, he pulled out the telephone book and made a call. "Hi, Pete. It's Ken Weber," he said after hearing his frat brother's voice. "Kenny, geez, it's good to hear from you. It's been too long." "What, almost 3 years?" boomed Pete Penderman. Pete and Ken were quite close in college, but as was usually the case, had drifted apart after graduation. "Yeah, Pete, it's a shame. We should get together for a drink or something. I don't get into the city that often, but how about if I drive in one day this week and we can meet?" "Sure, Kenny. I'd like that. But before you do, tell me what's bothering you. I know you just didn't decide to contact an old friend on the spur of the moment," asked Penderman. "You're right. As usual, Petey. I think I need to use your services. I'll tell you about it when I see you. How about Thursday evening? I can meet you at the Rittenhouse, okay?" There was a pause. "Okay, Ken. I'll meet you there. I gotta admit, you've got me curious, and oh, by the way, congratulations on the upcoming nuptials. It was in the paper here." Pete Penderman was the son of Hugh Penderman of Penderman and Penderman, attorneys at law, a prestigious law firm in Center City. The very wealthy used the firm for situations discreet and sensitive, and they had garnered an enviable reputation for handling matters in a way as not to offend the genteel sensibilities of the upper crust. Ken Weber's request of his buddy was simple: discreetly find out as much as possible about an assistant pastor by the name of Charles Moore. The law firm had an outstanding in-house investigative arm, and Ken was aware of this fact from conversations with Pete during their college years. Pete was curious, but he learned well. He said he would do as Ken asked, but also requested that he be informed about the rest of the story when appropriate. It took very little time. A few days later, Ken received a large envelope with all the pertinent data concerning this assistant pastor. There was much information concerning his early background, but it really got interesting when Ken got to the part about Moore's days at divinity school. It seems that Moore had transferred from the school in the Midwest just before his senior year to his sister school on the East Coast. The rumor had been that Moore had gotten a fellow student pregnant, but the girl had dropped out and there was no hard information that implicated him. Interestingly, the rumor persisted, which probably was the cause for the transfer. There was additional information, but it was sketchy and based on innuendo and rumor. Things about strange relationships between Moore and some of the married members of his flock. And while there was a paragraph about Moore's relationship with Connie Sterling, there was no mention of her pregnancy or abortion. The Sterlings seemed to have kept that information pretty well hidden from sources outside the community. The last item in the envelope was an 8x10 photograph of Charles Moore. Ken studied it intently for a few moments. Moore was a tall, slim, dark-haired man. He was dressed casually in a sport coat with a polo underneath. He was smiling at a point just to the left of where the camera must have been. Ken slowly replaced the photograph in the envelope, refastened the clasp, and placed the envelope in his briefcase. He then turned his chair and gazed thoughtfully out of the office window. Ken Weber lifted his head and glanced at the kitchen clock. He noted that he had been sitting and ruminating for almost 2 hours. He rose, stretched, and padded to the bar in the living room, where he poured 2 fingers of scotch and then added a couple of ice cubes. He sipped his drink and walked to the glass doors, slid them open, and stepped onto the balcony of his condo. He leaned against the railing and gazed up at the sky, now filled with the sparkle of a myriad stars. Ken raised his glass in salute, a bitter smile on his face. He knew what he had to do. He drained the glass and returned to the living room, where he carefully placed the now empty glass on an end table. He picked up the phone and dialed. It was time to put his plan into motion. "Hello, Pete? It's Ken." It didn't take long. In under 2 weeks, Ken had all he needed. They sat in Pete's den, Ken glancing almost indifferently through the stack of photographs. "Sorry, Kenny. They've been having at it ever since we started the investigation. They weren't even too clever about how they went about it. They were seen together often. It almost appeared that she wanted to be caught," Pete said quietly. Ken nodded. "I'm surprised that you were able to get such clear shots. Where were these taken?" "They rented a room for the afternoon at a motel in Jersey, across the river. The drapes weren't drawn together too carefully. My man just shot between the curtains," Pete snorted disgustedly. Ken smiled. "Yeah, they weren't too smart at all. This stayed at the bottom of the shots, that's accurate." Pete hesitated and grimaced a bit. "Yeah, Ken, sorry. Shit, just a few weeks before the wedding too." Ken prided himself on his acting ability. His demeanor at the bank and with Connie and her parents changed not. When in bed with his bride-to-be, he was still the amorous and considerate lover. He was aroused when appropriate, although it took a supreme strength of will. In the meantime, the swirl of wedding activities continued. Ken smiled inwardly each time that Horace Sterling grossed about the obscene cost of the affair. It was approaching 6 figures, but Margaret and Connie quickly overcame his objections. It was on an evening just days before the wedding. They had just finished rutting, that's how Ken viewed it in his mind, when Connie turned to him and queried, "Come on, Kenny, what's going on? What do you have planned?" Ken turned to her in surprise. What are you talking about, sweetie?" Connie shook her head in impatience. "You know, Ken, you've been looking like the cat who ate the canary. You know, kind of smug and self-satisfied. I know you. You have a surprise for me, don't you? Come on, honey. Tell me, please." It took a major effort for Ken not to laugh explosively. He managed to keep his mirth contained and moved to allay her curiosity. "Sweetie, you're just going to have to wait for the surprise. Let's just say that it has to do with our, honeymoon." "Right, the honeymoon. I knew it. I just knew it. We're going to Paris. That's it, isn't it, Kenny? We're going to spend our honeymoon in Paris, aren't we?" Ken smiled contentedly. "It's a surprise, sweetie, a big surprise. I'll tell you right after the wedding. You're just going to have to wait, sweetie. You're just going to have to wait." After the ceremony and at the reception, Ken strolled through the crowd, accepting the congratulations, smiling at everyone. He made his way to the small stage and, looking about, noticed, to his delight, that Charles Moore was an invited guest. Taking the microphone from the MC, he tapped it to make certain it was working, and he asked the crowd for their attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, folks," he paused, looking around the large hall, waiting for the hubbub to subside. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for coming, many of you from distant places, to support my bride and I at our wedding. Doesn't she look lovely in her beautiful white gown? Letting the applause die down, Ken continued. I would also like to thank my father-in-law and mother-in-law for providing such a lavish reception. Another round of applause. Ken beamed at the Sterlings. As a token of my deep appreciation, I want to give each of you a special gift from me. Taped to the bottom of each chair, you'll find a large envelope. Please take and open it now. Everyone bustled to retrieve the envelopes. Those seated at the wedding party table looked confused. There were no envelopes at the chairs there. Inside each envelope was an 8x10 glossy of his bride and Charles Moore, in exquisite detail, having sex. The crowd erupted in shock, and while there were gasps heard, there was also quite a few titters and laughter here and there. Ken continued, over the noise. My darling bride, be informed that I've taken steps to have this farce of a marriage annulled. Have a miserable life. And he turned and walked out of the hall. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.